She stood up in front of 40 guests, looked me dead in the eye, and said she'd always hoped her son would marry someone who actually mattered. I sat there and took it, because I didn't know yet that in less than an hour, she would find out exactly who she'd been insulting. That's what Sarah Bennett told a friend the next morning, still shaking from the night before. To understand how one birthday dinner could turn an entire family's world upside down, you have to go back to the beginning, to the quiet, unremarkable way Sarah first met the man everyone in his family had spent years underestimating. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Sarah met Michael Callahan on an ordinary Tuesday, in the kind of coffee shop that exists in every American town, the kind with mismatched chairs and a chalkboard menu that never quite gets erased all the way. She was a high school English teacher grading papers in the corner booth. He was a quiet man in a plain gray jacket who asked if he could borrow the extra chair at her table because the shop was full. She said yes without really looking up. He sat down, opened a laptop, and worked in silence for almost 20 minutes before he finally spoke. "I promise I'm not usually this boring company," he said, and Sarah laughed before she could stop herself. That was Michael in a single sentence. Unassuming, a little self-deprecating, easy to underestimate. He told her he worked in logistics and software, which sounded, to Sarah, like the kind of vague job description people give when they don't want to explain the details. She didn't push. Over the following months, as they dated, she learned he lived in a modest 2-bedroom rental across town, drove a 7-year-old Honda with a cracked side mirror he never bothered fixing, and preferred quiet dinners at home over anything flashy. He was kind, attentive, endlessly patient, and completely unbothered by appearances in a way Sarah found rare and refreshing. What she didn't know yet, what she wouldn't understand for nearly 2 more years, was that Michael had built something enormous, quietly, deliberately, and almost entirely out of his mother's sight. Sarah's own background made her, in some ways, exactly the kind of daughter-in-law Diane had never wanted. She'd grown up the only child of a single mother who worked double shifts as a nurse to keep them afloat in a small rental 2 towns over from where Diane now lived in considerably more comfort. Sarah had put herself through college on scholarships and a part-time job at a bookstore, had never once, in her entire life, attended anything resembling a country club function before she started dating Michael. She loved teaching, loved the particular chaos of a classroom full of teenagers discovering a book that mattered to them for the first time, and she had never once felt the job needed defending until she met a woman who managed, somehow, to make high school teacher sound like a euphemism for something unfortunate. It was, Sarah realized only in hindsight, exactly this background that made Diane's comments cut so precisely. Diane never said anything about Sarah's family directly, not in so many words, but she had a gift for the sideways remark that landed anyway, mentioning, at a dinner early in their relationship, how refreshing it was that Michael had found someone so unpretentious, in a tone that made the compliment sound like something closer to an apology on his behalf. Michael's mother was Diane Callahan, a woman who had spent the better part of 3 decades constructing a very specific image of herself, a poised, accomplished widow from old money on her late husband's side, active on the boards of 2 charities, a fixture at the country club, and, by her own account, a woman with impeccable taste in everything, including her children's choices. What almost none of Diane's current circle knew, and what Sarah only pieced together years later, from an offhand comment Michael's late father had once made, was that Diane hadn't actually been born into any of it. She'd grown up, the daughter of a shift supervisor at a manufacturing plant 2 states over, had worked her way through a state college on financial aid, and had met Michael's father, a quietly wealthy commercial real estate investor, at 24, in a version of her own life that looked, from the outside, remarkably similar to the one Sarah now lived. Diane had married into the world she now guarded so fiercely, and somewhere in the decades since, she had rebuilt her own history so thoroughly in her mind that she seemed to genuinely believe she'd always belonged there. When Michael's father died suddenly of a heart attack at 58, leaving Diane a widow at 52 with a country club membership and a social calendar that suddenly had no one to fund it but her own remaining discipline, something in her had hardened into a determination that neither of her sons would ever be allowed to slip back down into the kind of ordinary life she'd spent 30 years distancing herself from. Even if that meant refusing to see the value in a son who'd built something extraordinary, using exactly the kind of quiet, unglamorous discipline she'd once relied on herself. Diane had 2 sons. The elder, Preston, had gone into finance straight out of business school, married a woman named Blair from a similarly polished family, bought a house twice the size he needed in the most photographed neighborhood in the city, and called his mother every single Sunday. Preston was, by every visible metric Diane cared about, exactly the son she'd hoped to raise. Michael was different, and Diane had never quite forgiven him for it. As a teenager, Michael had been quiet and studious, more interested in taking apart old computers than attending the country club mixers his mother scheduled for him. He'd gotten into a good engineering program on a partial scholarship, something Diane treated less like an achievement and more like evidence that they hadn't been able to afford the better schools, even though the family had money to spare. After college, instead of following Preston into finance, Michael took a modest engineering job at a small logistics startup nobody in Diane's circle had ever heard of. At family gatherings, when someone asked what Michael did for a living, Diane would answer for him with a thin, practiced smile. "Oh, he does something with computers. Very technical. I don't pretend to understand it." It wasn't cruelty, exactly, at least not at first. It was something quieter and more corrosive. A persistent, low-grade dismissal that told Michael, year after year, that whatever he built would never be as impressive, in his mother's eyes, as what his brother had inherited into. Sarah heard about one particular memory from Michael only once, years into their marriage, and only after several glasses of wine had loosened something in him that usually stayed carefully closed. He was 17, and his high school robotics team, the one he'd spent nearly every afternoon that year building and rebuilding in the garage, had qualified for the state finals. It was, by any reasonable measure, a genuine achievement, the kind of thing that made local newspapers in smaller towns. Diane had promised to attend. She arrived 40 minutes late, missed the round Michael's team actually won, and spent the drive home describing, in detail, the tennis tournament Preston had placed in that same weekend, an event she had also missed, but had heard about secondhand from another club mother. "Your brother's getting quite good," she'd said, glancing at Michael in the rearview mirror. "Have you thought about picking up a real sport? College is like a well-rounded application." Michael had said nothing the rest of the ride home. He never mentioned robotics to his mother again, not even years later, when that same interest in engineering eventually became the foundation of everything he built. It was a small thing, in isolation, the kind of thing any parent might do once and forget entirely. But it was one of dozens of small things, repeated across 2 decades, each one teaching Michael the same lesson, a little more thoroughly, that his mother's attention and approval had a shape, and he simply didn't fit inside it. What Diane never knew was that the small logistics startup Michael joined at 24 had, within 6 years, become one of the most important supply chain software companies on the East Coast, and that Michael hadn't just worked there. He had built the core of its routing technology himself, patent by patent, then bought out the founding partners' shares one at a time as the company grew, quietly becoming its majority owner by the time he turned 31. He never announced any of it. He never corrected his mother when she waved off his career at dinner parties. He simply kept working, kept living in his modest rental, kept driving his old Honda, because somewhere along the way, Michael had decided he didn't need his mother's approval to know what he'd built was real. Sarah learned the full scope of it almost by accident, 18 months into their relationship, when a business magazine profile mentioned his company's revenue figures in passing while she was researching something unrelated for a lesson plan. She'd stared at the number on the screen for a long moment before calling him. "Is this you?" she'd asked, reading the figure out loud. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "Yeah," Michael said finally. "That's me. Why didn't you tell me?" "Because I wanted you to like me for me," he said, "not for a number in a magazine." Sarah understood, in that moment, something about Michael that would matter enormously later. He had learned, from a lifetime of being quietly diminished, to hide his own success as a form of self-protection. It wasn't modesty exactly. It was armor. Once the truth was out between them, Michael told her, slowly, over several conversations that unspooled across the following weeks, the actual story of how Meridian had come to be. He joined the company as its 4th employee, back when it operated out of a converted garage with 2 delivery trucks and a routing system built on a spreadsheet that broke every other week. The 2 founders, a pair of college friends who understood trucks far better than they understood software, had hired Michael to fix the spreadsheet problem. Instead, he'd spent 8 months building something entirely new from scratch, a piece of routing software so far ahead of anything the founders had imagined that within a year, 3 competing logistics firms had tried to poach him. He stayed, negotiating instead for equity, a decision that struck both founders as strange at the time, given that the company was, by any reasonable measure, barely surviving. "They thought I was being sentimental," Michael told Sarah, smiling faintly at the memory. "I just did the math and figured the software was worth more than the salary they could offer." He'd been right. Over the following 7 years, as Meridian's technology became the backbone of an increasingly large share of the regional shipping industry, Michael's equity stake grew from a modest 10% to eventual majority ownership, as one founder retired and the other, older and increasingly disinterested in day-to-day operations, sold his remaining shares to Michael directly rather than to an outside buyer. "He told me I'd built the thing that actually mattered," Michael said. "He just wanted to make sure it stayed in hands that understood that." Sarah asked him, that same evening, whether he'd ever tried telling his mother any of it, back when it was still new and exciting and genuinely worth celebrating. Michael was quiet for a long moment before answering. "Once," he said, "the week we signed our first $1 million contract, I drove straight to her house to tell her in person. I was so excited I could barely get the words out in order." He'd found Diane in the middle of planning one of Preston's birthday parties, spreading catering menus across the kitchen table. When he finally told her the news, she'd looked up, offered a distracted, "That's nice, honey," and gone straight back to comparing shrimp cocktail platters. "I stood there for maybe 30 seconds, Michael said, waiting for her to ask a single follow-up question. She never did. I got in my car and drove home, and I remember deciding, somewhere on that drive, that I wasn't going to hand her the chance to do that to me again. They married 2 years later. In a small ceremony, Michael insisted on keeping modest, much to Diane's visible irritation. "People will think we can't afford anything nicer," she'd said at the rehearsal dinner, loud enough for several guests to hear. Sarah had let it go. She'd learned, by then, to let a great many things go where Diane was concerned. Over the following years, the pattern repeated itself at nearly every family gathering. Thanksgiving dinners where Diane spent 20 minutes describing Preston and Blair's kitchen renovation and never once asked Michael a single question about his work. Christmas mornings where Diane's gifts to Preston's children were 3 times the size and cost of what she gave Michael and Sarah's daughter, Lily, a discrepancy Diane never acknowledged and Sarah never mentioned, for Michael's sake. Birthday calls where Diane would ask Sarah, with a smile that never quite reached her eyes, whether she'd found anything more permanent than teaching yet, as though a decade-long career, educating other people's children, was a temporary inconvenience Sarah simply hadn't gotten around to fixing. Michael absorbed all of it, with the same quiet patience he brought to everything else. "She's my mother," he'd say whenever Sarah grew frustrated on his behalf. "This is just who she is." But Sarah noticed, over the years, the way his jaw would tighten during these moments, the way he'd go quiet in the car on the drive home, the way he never once mentioned his actual net worth to a woman who spent every gathering implying he'd failed to build one. There was one person in Diane's circle who seemed to notice the pattern too, a longtime family friend named Helen Marsh, who had known Diane since their own college days and had watched both boys grow up from a front-row seat at every holiday gathering for 30 years. Helen had never said anything directly, not in all that time, but Sarah caught her more than once, watching Michael with an expression that looked almost like quiet apology, as though she wished she had the standing to say something, and simply didn't. Once, at a 4th of July barbecue, Sarah overheard Helen murmur to another guest, just out of Diane's earshot, "That boy's built something real. She's just never once bothered to ask him what." Sarah had filed the comment away without quite knowing why, only understanding its significance much later. Lily, too, absorbed more of the pattern than either parent realized at the time. She was only 6 the year she came home from a visit to her grandmother's house and asked Sarah, with the blunt honesty only a 6-year-old can manage, "Why does Grandma like Cousin Tyler's toys better than mine?" Sarah had struggled to answer honestly without teaching her daughter to resent anyone, settling instead on a gentle, "Some people show love in ways that aren't always fair, Sweetheart. And that's about them, not about you. Michael, overhearing the exchange from the next room, had gone very quiet for the rest of that evening, and Sarah understood, without either of them saying it out loud, that he was watching his own childhood begin to repeat itself one generation later, and that it was breaking something in him, a little more each time. The Thanksgiving before Diane's 65th birthday brought the pattern into particularly sharp focus. Preston had recently made partner at his firm, and Diane spent nearly the entire meal steering conversation back to the promotion, asking Blair to describe, in detail, the corner office Preston had been given, the client dinner the firm had thrown in his honor, the framed announcement that now hung in their front hallway. When one of Diane's cousins, making polite conversation, turned to Michael and asked what he'd been working on lately, Diane answered before he could open his mouth. "Oh, Michael's still doing his computer thing," she said, waving a hand vaguely, already turning back toward Preston. "It keeps him busy, I suppose." Sarah watched Michael's fork pause over his plate for exactly one beat too long before he resumed eating in silence. Later that night, driving home, he'd said only, 20 years, and she still doesn't know what department I work in, let alone that I own the company. Sarah hadn't known what to say, so she'd simply reached over and held his hand the rest of the way home. It was this same Thanksgiving, in fact, where Diane first mentioned, with visible enthusiasm, that she'd invited a wonderful new friend to her upcoming birthday dinner, a woman named Rachel she'd met through the hospital charity board earlier that year, someone Diane described as very impressive, very connected in the business world. Diane had spent nearly 10 minutes describing Rachel's poise, her sharp business instincts, the impressive title she apparently held at some company Diane couldn't quite recall the name of, entirely unaware that she was describing, in admiring detail, the very same woman who would stand up at her own party months later and dismantle, in under 2 minutes, the exact hierarchy Diane had spent 30 years building between her two sons. Nobody at that table, least of all Diane, had any idea just how connected Rachel Voss's business world actually overlapped with their own families. Which brings us to the birthday dinner. Diane's 65th, held at the country club's private dining room, with 40 guests, a 5-course meal, and a string quartet. Diane had specifically requested play during the appetizer course because, in her words, it sets the right tone for people who understand these things. Sarah had spent weeks looking forward to the evening with a kind of cautious optimism she now recognizes, looking back, as almost embarrassingly naive. Lily, now 8, had made her grandmother a card by hand, carefully drawing a garden of flowers across the front, because Diane had once mentioned, in passing, that she loved gardening. Sarah had helped Lily pick out a small, thoughtful gift, a framed photograph from a trip the three of them had taken together the previous summer, one of the only times Diane had seemed genuinely warm toward them. Sarah had even bought a new dress for the occasion, something she rarely did, hoping, in the quiet way people hope even when they know better, that tonight might be different. The evening began pleasantly enough. Guests arrived in a steady stream of tailored coats and polite small talk, the country club's private room glowing under warm chandelier light. Blair greeted Sarah with a hug that felt, as it usually did, 1 degree too brief to be entirely sincere, then spent several minutes describing a recent trip to the Amalfi Coast in enough detail that Sarah found herself nodding along without really listening. Preston shook Michael's hand and asked, in the same tone he always used, "Still keeping busy with the computer stuff?" Michael said yes, and nothing more, the way he always did. It was not different. The trouble began during the toasts, after the main course had been cleared and the string quartet had shifted into something soft and instrumental beneath the murmur of 40 conversations. Preston went first, raising his glass to describe his mother as the most elegant, accomplished woman I've ever known, which drew warm applause. Then Blair spoke briefly about Diane's generosity, gesturing at the diamond bracelet Diane had apparently gifted her the week before, just because, a detail Sarah noticed land somewhere just behind her ribs, given that Lily's birthday gift from Diane that year had been a $20 gift card. Then Diane rose to speak herself, thanking her guests, thanking Preston and Blair by name for always making her proud, and then, without any particular warning, turning her gaze toward the table where Sarah and Michael sat. "And of course," Diane said, her voice carrying easily across the room, the practiced smile still fixed in place. "I have to say something about my other son's family, too." A small, polite ripple of laughter moved through the guests, the kind reserved for a joke everyone senses is coming before it lands. "Michael has always marched to his own beat," Diane continued. "Modest job, modest house, modest everything, really." She let that hang in the air for half a second longer than was comfortable. "I used to worry he'd never find someone who could see past all that. But Sarah's been very understanding of his, let's say, more limited circumstances." She turned her smile toward Sarah directly now, the whole room following her gaze. "I've always admired a woman who can love a man for who he is, not for what he has. Because Lord knows, with Michael, that's really all you get." The laughter that followed was quieter this time, uncertain, but it was there, moving through the room like something spilled that no one quite knew how to clean up. Sarah felt her face go hot, then cold, then hot again. Beside her, she felt Michael go completely still, the particular stillness she'd only seen a handful of times in their marriage, the stillness of a man absorbing an insult he'd absorbed 1,000 times before and had simply run out of room to hold. Across the table, Lily looked up from her plate, sensing, the way children always seem to, that something in the air had shifted, even if she couldn't have said exactly what. Sarah opened her mouth, unsure what she even planned to say, when a woman Sarah didn't recognize stood up from a table near the back of the room. She was perhaps in her late 50s, sharply dressed in a way that read as expensive without trying to announce itself, and she was holding her champagne glass slightly raised, as though she'd been waiting for exactly the right pause to speak. "I'm sorry," the woman said, her voice cutting cleanly through the murmur. "I don't think we've met, but I have to say something, because I don't think most of this room understands who they're talking about." Every head in the room turned toward her. Diane's smile faltered for the first time all evening. "My name is Rachel Voss," the woman continued. "I'm the Chief Financial Officer at Meridian Supply Networks." She paused, letting the name settle over a room that clearly meant nothing to most of the people in it, and everything to a handful. "Michael, I didn't realize you'd be here tonight, or I would have said hello sooner. I just wanted to say, on behalf of the board, congratulations again on the acquisition news. We're all still a little stunned, honestly. $840 million is not a number any of us expected to see on paper this year." The room went silent in a way that felt almost physical. Diane's champagne glass hovered halfway to her lips, frozen there. "I'm sorry," Diane said finally, her voice thinner than before. "I think there's been some confusion. My son works in, well, computers. Logistics, I believe." Rachel Voss tilted her head, genuinely confused for a moment, before understanding seemed to dawn on her face. "Michael owns Meridian," she said slowly, looking between Diane and Michael as though trying to work out how, exactly, this fact had failed to reach the woman's mother. "He's been the majority shareholder for almost 4 years. He built the routing software the entire company runs on. We just closed the largest acquisition offer in the company's history 2 weeks ago. And half the reason the deal held together was because Michael personally renegotiated the terms with the buyers at 2 a.m. last Thursday." She looked at Michael again, this time with something like fond exasperation. "You really didn't tell your own mother any of this?" Every guest at every table was staring now. 40 conversations collapsed into a single, expanding silence. Near the back, an elderly man Sarah recognized as one of Diane's longtime bridge partners leaned toward his wife and murmured, just loud enough to carry, "Well, I don't think I've ever seen Diane at a loss for words before." A few tables over, one of Preston's colleagues from the firm had actually pulled out his phone, thumbs already moving, and Sarah understood, with a distant kind of dread, that whatever happened in the next 60 seconds was very likely already being typed into a group chat somewhere. Helen Marsh, still watching from her table near the back, had gone very still, her champagne glass untouched, her expression unreadable except for the faint, private satisfaction Sarah thought she caught in the set of her jaw. Michael set down his own glass slowly, deliberately, the way he did everything. He didn't smile. He didn't gloat. He simply looked at his mother, across the same table where, moments earlier, she had described him as a modest man with modest everything, and he said, quietly enough that only the nearest tables could hear, but clearly enough that the silence carried his words to every corner of the room anyway. "I didn't think it would matter to you, Mom. It never has before. Diane's face went through several expressions in rapid succession. Confusion, disbelief, something that looked almost like the beginning of tears, before settling into a kind of stunned blankness Sarah had genuinely never seen on her before. 800 million, Preston said from across the table, his voice oddly flat, as though he were trying the number out loud to see if it would make more sense that way. It didn't. Blair had gone very quiet beside him, her earlier warmth toward the evening replaced with something considerably more calculating, her eyes flicking toward Michael with an expression that made Sarah distinctly uncomfortable, as though she were already recalculating exactly how much attention this branch of the family deserved going forward. For a long moment, nobody at the head table spoke. The string quartet, either unaware of what had just happened or professionally determined to ignore it, continued playing softly in the corner, an absurd, gentle counterpoint to the wreckage unfolding across the room. A few tables away, Sarah caught sight of Helen Marsh, the family friend who had watched this dynamic unfold for 30 years, sitting very still with an expression that looked almost like relief. Sarah reached for Michael's hand under the table, and he took it without looking away from his mother. "I think," Michael said finally, standing, "we're going to head out a little early tonight. Happy birthday, Mom." He said it without malice, without triumph, in the same even tone he used for almost everything, and somehow that made it land harder than any angrier version of the sentence could have. They left the country club a few minutes later, Lily's hand-drawn card still sitting untouched on the gift table, and the ride home was almost entirely silent, the kind of silence that isn't empty so much as full, both of them turning the same evening over in their minds from two very different angles. It was Sarah who finally spoke, somewhere around the halfway point of the drive. $840 million, she said, not quite a question. Before taxes, Michael said, and despite everything, Sarah found herself laughing, a short, disbelieving laugh that dissolved almost immediately into something closer to tears. "Why didn't you ever tell her?" Sarah asked. "Not even once, in all these years?" Michael was quiet for a while, watching the road. "Because the first time I ever tried, back when I was 26 and we'd just closed our first big contract, she asked me if this meant I'd finally be settling for a real job soon." He shook his head slowly. "After that, I stopped trying to prove anything to her. I figured if the work was good, it would speak for itself eventually, to the people who actually mattered. I just didn't expect it to speak up quite like that, at her own birthday dinner, in front of everyone she was trying to impress." "Do you think she meant any of it?" Sarah asked after a while. "The stuff about me being understanding of your circumstances?" Michael glanced at her, something softening in his expression despite everything. "I think she meant it as a compliment to you and an insult to me, and never once considered it might land as an insult to both of us." He was quiet for a moment. "For what it's worth, you've never once been understanding of my circumstances. You've just loved me. There's a difference, and I don't think she's ever learned it." Sarah reached over and squeezed his hand. "I've loved you since a coffee shop where you couldn't even find a chair," she said. "The 800 million is honestly the least interesting thing about you." Michael laughed, a real laugh this time, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly for the first time since the toasts had started. "Don't tell my mother that," he said. "It might actually break her." In the back seat, Lily had fallen asleep against the window, her hand-drawn flowers left behind on a gift table she'd never see again, though neither of her parents knew that yet. In the days that followed, word of what happened at the dinner spread through the extended family with the particular speed reserved for stories too good and too humiliating not to repeat. Aunts called cousins. Cousins called each other. By the following weekend, half the family seemed to know the outline of what had happened, even if the exact number kept shifting slightly with each retelling, ballooning in some versions to well over $1 billion, shrinking in others to a modest few million, depending entirely on who was doing the telling. Diane called 3 times in the first week. Michael let all 3 calls go to voicemail. It wasn't spite, he told Sarah, though she suspected some small part of it was. It was simply that he needed time to sit with what had happened before he decided what, if anything, he wanted to say to his mother about it. Preston called too, and this conversation Michael did take, mostly, Sarah suspected, out of genuine surprise. "I had no idea," Preston kept repeating, an odd note of something between admiration and resentment in his voice. "All these years and you just, what, let her think you were struggling?" Beneath the surprise, Sarah thought she detected something else in Preston's voice, a faint unease, as though he were quietly recalculating 30 years of assumed hierarchy between the two brothers, and not entirely liking where the new math landed. "I let her think whatever she was going to think regardless of what I said," Michael replied. "It stopped being about the money a long time ago." Blair, notably, did not call at all that first week, though Sarah heard through a cousin, who'd heard it from Preston himself in a moment of unusual candor, exactly what had happened in the Callahan's car on the drive home from the country club that night. According to Preston, Blair had said almost nothing for the first 10 minutes, staring out the window with an expression he couldn't quite read, before finally turning to him and asking, with no trace of humor at all, whether they'd been invited to Michael and Sarah's house for dinner recently, and if not, whether they ought to fix that soon. Preston, still reeling from the number itself, had laughed before realizing she was completely serious. "You spent 6 years barely speaking to him at family dinners," he reportedly said to her, "and now you want to become close?" Blair hadn't answered directly, only reminded him, coolly, that family was family, and that it would be a shame to let old habits get in the way of staying close to people who mattered. Preston relayed the story to Michael months later, half as an apology and half, Sarah suspected, as his own quiet way of processing what the money had revealed about people far beyond just his mother. Sarah's own mother, when she heard the story secondhand from Sarah over the phone, laughed so hard she had to sit down. "That woman spent a decade telling you you'd married beneath yourself," she said, once she'd recovered enough to speak clearly. "I could not have written a better ending if I tried." Then, more quietly, she added, "I hope this doesn't change anything for you two, though. The money, I mean. You were happy before anyone in that room knew a number." Sarah promised her it wouldn't, and found, turning the promise over in the following weeks, that she meant it more than she expected to. Michael was still the same man who reused tea bags twice and fell asleep during every single movie they tried to watch together. A number attached to his name in a magazine article hadn't changed a single thing about the person she'd actually married. In the 2 weeks between the dinner and Diane's visit, Michael and Sarah had one long conversation of their own, late one night after Lily had gone to bed, about whether they even wanted his mother back in their lives in any meaningful way. "I don't need her approval anymore," Michael said, sitting on the edge of their bed. "I stopped needing it a long time ago, honestly. But I keep thinking about Lily, and whether I want her to grow up with a grandmother who treats her the way mine treated me." Sarah had no easy answer for that. She'd spent years quietly protecting Lily from the sharper edges of Diane's attention, and the idea of simply walking away entirely felt, in some ways, like the easiest and most tempting option available to them. But she also remembered her own mother, working double shifts to give her a life Diane could never have imagined coming from, and how much Sarah would have given, as a child, for even a fraction of the family Diane theoretically offered, however imperfectly. "I don't think we owe her a relationship," Sarah said finally. "But I think, if she's capable of actually changing, it might be worth finding out. For Lily's sake, if nothing else." Michael had nodded slowly, and it was that conversation, more than any single instinct on his part, that softened him enough to open the door without hesitation when his mother showed up unannounced not long after. 2 weeks after the dinner, Diane showed up at their house unannounced, standing on the porch in a coat far too formal for a Tuesday afternoon, looking, for the first time in Sarah's memory, uncertain of her welcome. "May I come in?" she asked, and something in her voice, stripped of its usual polish, made Sarah step aside without hesitation. They sat in the living room, the three of them, in a silence that stretched long enough to become uncomfortable before Diane finally spoke. "I've been trying to understand," she said slowly, "why you never told me." She looked down at her hands. "And I think, if I'm honest with myself, I already know the answer. I just don't like it very much." Michael said nothing, waiting. "I spent so many years measuring you against Preston," Diane continued, her voice unsteady in a way Sarah had genuinely never heard before. "Against the version of success I understood, the version I grew up believing mattered. And every time you didn't fit that picture, I decided that meant something was missing in you, instead of considering, even once, that maybe the picture itself was too small." She looked up, finally meeting his eyes. "I humiliated you at my own birthday dinner because some part of me had already decided, years ago, that you were the son who hadn't quite measured up. And I said it in front of 40 people because I never once imagined I might be wrong." "You weren't just wrong about the money, Mom," Michael said quietly. You were wrong about a lot more than that. You missed my state finals to watch a tennis match Preston didn't even win that weekend. You've never once asked me what I actually build for a living. Not in 15 years. The money is the part everyone's talking about now, but it was never really the point. Diane's composure finally broke completely, tears slipping down her face in a way that felt, to Sarah, almost startlingly human. After years of watching the woman maintain an expression of polished control at every single family gathering. "I know," Diane whispered. "I know I was." She reached into her handbag and pulled out an old photograph, worn soft at the corners, and set it on the coffee table between them. It was Michael, perhaps 8 years old, standing proudly beside a homemade birdhouse, grinning at the camera with a gap-toothed smile. "I found this last week, going through old boxes," Diane said quietly. "You built that whole thing yourself, from scrap wood in the garage, and I remember being so busy planning Preston's birthday party that same weekend that I barely looked at it before packing it away." She traced the edge of the photograph with one finger. "I've been asking myself ever since how many of those moments I have stacked away in boxes somewhere, waiting for me to finally notice them properly. I don't like the number I keep arriving at." Michael studied the photograph for a long moment without picking it up. "I remember that birdhouse," he said finally. "A bird actually moved in that spring. I was so proud of it I could barely sleep." He looked up at his mother. "You told me birds probably wouldn't like the paint color, and that maybe I should have asked Preston to help me pick something more traditional." Diane closed her eyes. "I don't even remember saying that," she admitted. "But I believe you. That sounds exactly like something I would have said." The conversation that followed was not a full reconciliation, not that afternoon, and Sarah suspected it would take considerably longer than one uncomfortable Tuesday for something that had calcified over 3 decades to fully soften. But it was, for the first time either of them could remember, an honest one. Diane admitted, haltingly, to a lifetime of measuring her children by a yardstick that had more to do with her own insecurities than anything either son had actually done. She admitted that Preston's easy fit into her world had always felt, to her, like a kind of validation she desperately needed and had never examined too closely, and that Michael's quiet refusal to chase that same validation had always read to her as rejection, rather than simply a different way of being in the world. In the months that followed, things changed slowly, the way real change usually does, in small, unglamorous increments rather than a single dramatic turn. Diane started calling to ask actual questions about Michael's work. Awkward at first, clearly unfamiliar with the vocabulary, but sincere in a way that mattered more than the vocabulary ever could. She began treating Lily's birthday gifts with something closer to the attention she'd always given Preston's children, not out of guilt exactly, though there was some of that too, but out of what seemed like a genuine, if belated, effort to see her family more clearly than she had before. It wasn't a smooth road. There was a stretch, about 4 months in, when Diane invited herself to one of Michael's rare public speaking engagements, a small industry panel about supply chain technology, and spent the drive home afterward asking so many earnest, slightly clumsy questions about routing algorithms that Michael finally laughed, for what Sarah realized was the first time she'd heard in front of his mother in years. It wasn't perfect understanding, but it was effort, visible and sustained, and Sarah found that mattered more than she expected it to. Preston's adjustment was slower and considerably more complicated. For months after the dinner, he seemed caught between pride in his brother and a quiet, unspoken grief over 3 decades spent believing he'd simply been the more successful son, only to learn the comparison had never really been close to begin with. He and Michael had one long, difficult conversation on Preston's back porch that winter, the details of which neither brother ever fully shared with Sarah, but which seemed to leave something easier between them afterward, a kind of cautious new footing. Neither of them rushed to test too hard. That spring, at Lily's school science fair, Diane showed up unannounced, arriving 20 minutes early, rather than her usual habit of arriving fashionably, and sometimes not at all, late. She spent nearly half an hour crouched beside Lily's baking soda volcano display, asking earnest questions about chemical reactions, with the same slightly clumsy sincerity she'd brought to Michael's routing algorithms months earlier. When Lily won second place in her age group, Diane clapped louder than anyone else in the gymnasium, and Sarah, watching from a few feet away, felt something in her chest loosen that she hadn't realized had been clenched for years. There was also, inevitably, at least one significant stumble. That same summer, At a smaller family barbecue, Diane introduced Michael to a new acquaintance as "my son who runs a technology company," a phrase that sounded, on its surface, like real progress, until she added, almost reflexively, "He's very hands-on, still drives himself around in that funny little car of his," and Sarah watched Michael's shoulders tense for just a moment before he let it go. Old habits, it turned out, did not dissolve simply because the underlying facts had changed. They had to be unlearned, deliberately, one clumsy sentence at a time, and Diane, to her credit, kept trying even when she got it wrong. Preston's adjustment continued alongside his mother's, in its own separate, quieter way. By the following summer, he'd started asking Michael real questions of his own, not out of competition anymore, Sarah thought, but out of something closer to genuine curiosity about a brother he realized he'd never actually taken the time to know. The two of them began meeting for lunch every few weeks, something that had never once happened in all the years Sarah had known the family. And while neither brother ever fully closed the distance 3 decades of unequal attention had built between them, something real and workable took its place instead. Sarah, for her part, found herself surprised by how little satisfaction the whole ordeal actually gave her once the initial shock wore off. She had spent years quietly resenting Diane's dismissiveness, had imagined, in weaker moments, some version of exactly this reckoning, and yet, when it finally arrived, it didn't feel like victory so much as a kind of sad, overdue clarity. Michael had built an extraordinary life quietly, out of his mother's sight, not because he wanted to hide it forever, but because somewhere along the way he'd stopped believing her opinion of it could ever be fair. Watching that finally crack open, watching Diane confront the cost of 30 years of misplaced judgment, felt less like triumph and more like watching someone finally set down a weight she hadn't realized she was still carrying. Michael never did give an interview about the acquisition, never posted anything about the number that had detonated so spectacularly across his mother's birthday dinner. He went back to work the following Monday in the same modest home office he'd always used, driving the same 7-year-old Honda, which he still, to Sarah's mild exasperation, refused to trade in. "You could buy the dealership," she told him one evening, only half joking. "I like this car," he said simply, and she let it go, because by then she understood that Michael had never measured his own worth by the things his mother had spent a lifetime measuring hers by, and that this, more than any number on an acquisition contract, was the real inheritance he'd given their daughter. The quiet, hard-won knowledge that who you are was never something anyone else got to decide for you, no matter how loudly or how publicly they tried. A year later, at Diane's 66th birthday, a much smaller gathering this time, held at Diane's own request in her backyard, rather than the country club, Diane stood to give a short toast before dinner. She didn't mention numbers. She didn't mention acquisitions or companies or anything Rachel Voss had said that night. She simply raised her glass toward Michael and Sarah, sitting together at the far end of the table with Lily between them, and said, "To my son, who built something real, and never once needed my permission to know it. I'm only sorry it took me so long to see it too." It wasn't a grand ending. No single dramatic gesture undoing 30 years of quiet dismissal in an instant. But it was, Sarah thought, watching Michael's face soften in a way she rarely saw around his mother, exactly the kind of ending that mattered most. Not loud, not showy, just true, in the same understated way Michael had always been. 2 years after that birthday dinner, Sarah found herself back at the same country club for an entirely different occasion this time, Lily's 10th birthday, a small gathering Diane had insisted on hosting herself in the same private dining room, though this time with a guest list of 12 rather than 40. Diane had spent the morning helping Lily pick out balloon colors, a small gesture that would have seemed unremarkable in any other family, and felt, in this one, like its own quiet miracle. At one point during the party, Diane pulled Sarah aside near the dessert table, watching Michael across the room as he knelt down to help Lily light the candles on her cake. "I still think about that dinner sometimes," Diane said quietly. "Not the money part. The part where I stood up in front of everyone and decided, out loud, that my own son was worth less than his brother." She shook her head slowly. "I don't think I'll ever fully forgive myself for that, no matter how many science fairs I show up early to." Sarah considered her words for a moment before answering. "I think the fact that you're still thinking about it 2 years later is probably the whole point," she said. "He didn't need you to fix it overnight. He just needed you to actually see him. You're doing that now." Diane nodded, her eyes bright, and turned back toward the cake, where Lily had just blown out 10 candles in one triumphant breath, and where Michael, still crouched beside his daughter, still driving the same 7-year-old Honda, parked outside, still, every bit as quietly unbothered by appearances as the day Sarah met him in that cluttered coffee shop years earlier, was laughing at something Lily had whispered in his ear, entirely unconcerned with whatever anyone in that room thought he was worth.